presentation I'm tremendously excited for. It's people who are tackling what consistently is the most difficult of the topics that we have to engage with. But before we get to them, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This is the 162nd gathering of the local systems community. Thank you all for being here. And because of how timing has worked out in the new year, we have another one for next month, which is coming up in just over a week. We will have a metropolitan group presenting on values-based narratives and how they can advance or delegitimize democracy. That will actually also be a hybrid event for those I can see from the chat that we are far-flung, scattered around the world, but for those of you who are in the DC area, we welcome you to come and join us. The room is in the invitation, and you can actually meet the presenters in person, which is not always the case, even pre-COVID, but certainly post-COVID. It's been few and far between, so a nice opportunity. But with that, one other note, we are, as always, going to record this. So please, if you don't want to be recorded, the time to opt out is now, and otherwise what you say will be recorded. So take care of what you are saying, and please mute your microphone unless you are jumping in to ask a question. You can also post questions or add comments in the chat box, and people will be monitoring that. But with that, let me hand it over to Kristen.
Hi, everyone. I am Kristen O'Planick. For those who don't know me, I sit in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security, and I'm trying to juggle some things around here to get the slides up, so bear with me a second. Today is exciting. I think we're gonna, like David said, we're gonna talk about a hot topic here, tensions and solutions for USAID in systems programming. And we've got a wonderful cast of characters joining us from Rwanda, USAID and implementer staff, and they're going to unpack what's working for them with this relationship and with systems change MEL. So how do we manage these tensions that we face in measuring systemic changes in our programming? We talk about this constantly, but then it seems we all kind of really get stuck on what do we actually do. So today we're going to look at 3 of these tensions specifically with the practical experience from USAID Rwanda and representatives from Land O'Lakes Venture 37 and Market Share Associates who worked on the Feed the Future Oraro Wahazi activity. And we're going to focus on that particular activity because it's what they called the eldest child within their market systems development portfolio. So it has the deepest story to go with it. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ben Fowler while I pull up the slides, and he's going to manage the conversation today. Make sure we have some time at the end for questions, but please do put them in the chat along the way. And Ben is the CEO of Market Share Associates and the technical lead of our Feed the Future Market Systems and Partnerships activity, the monitoring and evaluation and CLA learning stream. So very focused on these issues over the last couple of years and will continue to be. So Ben, I'm going to hand it to you and get those slides up. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kristen and everybody for inviting us to be here today. We're very excited. So as Kristen mentioned, what we're presenting and sharing to you today is been coming out of the Market Systems and Partnerships activity. It's a 6-year activity, and it has 5 different learning streams. The one that has been focused, and which, as Kristen mentioned, I lead, has been focused for the last 3.5 years, in part upon precisely the issue of how do you, when you're looking at system type programming, determine how to effectively measure your results and see what is actually happening. And to do that, we've engaged quite substantially with practitioners as well as with USAID to really understand from a very practical basis, what are some of those key impediments? What's holding us up in being able to more effectively measure it? We know it's even in the name when we talk about market systems development that we are taking a systems approach, and we want to understand and encourage changes within that area. We'll go to, if Kristen, the next slide, please. And yet, when we aim to do so, we find that we are facing a series of impediments. And so on the next slide, what we're going to share with you in the next couple of slides is some of the challenges that we actually have harvested in speaking to implementing partners and speaking to USAID, both on the ground, people embedded directly within activities, as well as people at the HQ level that are seeking to support programs from afar. So on the next slide, we applied this kind of iceberg tool that many of you are familiar with to really understand what is holding us back. And on the next slide, we have some of the answers that we heard. At a very systematic level, no systemic change questions are being asked, perhaps, or we're only looking at performance indicators. If we go a level deeper, people cited donor requirements, really making it hard to spend the time needed to go beyond the standard indicators and start looking at more system level change. Or perhaps even therefore that resulting in a trend of kind of making up or putting like broad picture ideas of what systemic change looked like. If we look a step deeper than that, we see who's being involved is perhaps not involving the local actors that actually make up these systems. And sometimes a lack of adequate people and finances that would allow systemic change measurement to occur in the way it needs to. And finally, if we go to the level of mental models, things that we understood and that we heard from the team, were success really being understood as being the short-term results that you can measure within an activity lifetime, an inadequate commitment to activity leadership for systemic change, and also, some of those bigger picture challenges and even thinking maybe systemic change is too complicated. When we summarized across all the different studies we did, on the next slide, we have three main areas or kind of encapsulations of the core problems that we heard. One is just the overwhelm that people feel with the indicators, the log frames, all of the standard things that people need to be measuring. Secondly, a perception that systemic change measurement gets overcomplicated, either in terms of where boundaries are set or the tools and approaches that are taken. That makes it seem perhaps not something that we can really take on. And finally, a third challenge around seeing this as primarily an issue of training and tools rather than a mindset or a way of thinking to understand challenges that we face. So that's a quick a quick background of some of the challenges that we heard that are kind of impeding right now some of the practice, and which MSP has been aiming to address via a set of practitioner guidance that I'm going to present shortly, as well as some on-the-ground work that we're doing to really help programs to advance. So if we go to the next slide, I'm very pleased that we're going to spend today jumping into a specific case within Rwanda of where some of these issues have been tackled for the last 4.5 years or so on the Aurora Wahazi program. And I have a very superstar guest here, panel, that I'm going to be having speak. So on the next slide, we have, oh, pardon me. I'm getting ahead of myself. No, please go forward. The three tensions we're going to be exploring. One is, how do we practically weave systemic change into the activity design and its MEL system in the midst and despite some of the challenges we've heard? How do we deal with the expectations about immediate results when we're seeking to create deeper system level change? And finally, how can we capture signs that those systemic changes are actually happening? So we're going to walk through each of those three today. On the next slide, I'm now going to introduce our panel. So we have Evan Meyer, who's the Deputy Office Director and Feed the Future Coordinator with USAID Rwanda's Economic Growth Office, alongside his colleague Jean Damascene, who's the Agricultural Productivity Team Lead, as well as the COR for Aurora Wahazi. And then joining us from the Aurora Wahazi team, we have Dennis Karamuzi, who's the Chief of Party and is with Land O'Lakes. We have Vivehan Jayagaran, who is an advisor with Market Share Associates and a long-term technical advisor on the program. And we have David Biringiro, who's a senior learning advisor on Aurora Wahazi and also with Market Share Associates. And I would be remiss to not point out that I can already see many other people who've joined the call today and who also have had a very big role in supporting the success of Aurora Wahazi and some of the things it's been doing. So I'm sure when it comes to the Q&A, there may be a lot of more contributions that don't even just come from our 5 panelists. But with that, I'm going to turn it over and kick off with the first tension. So I'd like to ask of our USAID colleagues, given what we've heard, and knowing also that Aurora Wahazi was the eldest child, so to speak, within your portfolio that's been taking more of a systems approach, can you walk us through what were some of the tensions that you experienced in trying to weave a kind of system-oriented approach into your work amidst the various contractual and other requirements and kind of standard way of operating that you're used to?
Okay, thanks, Ben. When we started initially in the design, this was before I was here, but in terms of the discussion, the team was looking at where were the challenges around animal source foods consumption, and that here in Rwanda it's fairly low. There's high rates of malnutrition, high rates of stunting, even though that the government and the country has done a great job in reducing those numbers. At present, they're at 33%, and when this started, they were probably at 36, or when the design started, it was at least at 38% because it's come down over the last 5 or 6 years. And the idea was, how do we work in a sustainable way towards animal source foods? Initially, the team, I don't think, was even thinking about a market systems approach, but the mission director at the time poked the team and said, what are sustainable outcomes around working on animal source foods, around those types of products? And the result was that those are the only places where there was a sustainable outcome in terms of long-term past the life of the project, or where there was something that was market-based. So it got the team to start thinking about taking a market systems approach. And also traditionally the whole nutrition approach was more around behavioral change and focused more on kind of a health office kind of focus, which is important, but it wasn't as holistic as how do we deal with the market piece around making animal source foods more affordable and available, et cetera. One of the issues, I think, once the design, once the activity started, I think that there were initial assumptions made that the value chains that the activity would work with were in a much better state than they were, in terms of more developed, more mature, and they were pretty much in tatters in terms of the. I think we were working with poultry, aquaculture, and also small ruminants and pig, swine as well. And just that they weren't, a lot of the actors in the value chain just weren't, there was a lot of capacity building that had to go on. And I think that in terms of the initial planning part, they were a lot further behind in terms of where they thought they'd be for moving things forward. So I think that kind of got things off to a kind of a challenging start. And in terms of measurement, the drivers weren't around facilitation initially, but I think that's probably also because the team, this was their first foray into market systems. And so I think that if you want to talk about an iceberg, they were looking above the surface. They weren't, reactionary against those things, but I think that they just didn't have that focus. And while there were some systems change elements that were woven into it, and I know that Dennis will talk about that, it just wasn't the central focus from USAID Rwanda's piece. It was there, but that wasn't the central focus. And then also on the market systems piece, I think the team was getting into it. It was the first market system activity in our portfolio. And sometimes people get into something and they're kind of, it's like rushing out into the street and all of a sudden realizing there's traffic coming at you, that they were just starting and grasp the complexity. So there were champions at the mission, but still, I think for the team in general, getting them to change their mental models and understand what it meant to work on a market systems versus a direct delivery activity, that was a bit of a kind of a shift. Over.
Great. Thank you very much, Evan. Well, let's turn it over to the Aurora Wahazi team now. Dennis, maybe if we flip to the next slide, do you want to talk about some of the ways that Aurora Wahazi built in this kind of system approach in the start, in spite of the kind of the other many, I'm sure, competing demands on your time as you kicked off the program?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. As you can see in the slide, we have a theory of change that sets quite an ambitious goal at the top to sustainably increase the availability of access to and consumption of animal source food through the development of a profitable market. That in itself, we felt was quite an ambitious statement, but it is properly guided as we went into implementation to develop a full sort of flow of how this would come about. You will see the top objectives here, which include strengthening private sector around the animal source foods value chain, as well as growing demand for animal source foods, especially targeting women and men. Now, at the bottom of this theory of change, you'll see the driving interventions, which we set out clearly with the USAID to be or to provide some clarity on how we would achieve the broader goal of the project. And so beyond thinking through, for example, if you look at an intervention one, which is a focus on development of animal source foods, across the board, you see there's 6 interventions which feed into the 2 broad objectives. But that in itself is expected to lead to some outcomes higher up. But we started off by clearly identifying some system level indicators that we wanted to provide that level of clarity that when that is happening, then we have a good impression of how we would achieve the outcomes and eventually the impact at the project level. And so we sort of weaved into the activity these system level sort of indicators in conversation with USAID, and agreed that with those we can also, within our MEL plan, include a set of custom indicators that include indicators like trust and cooperation that can easily be measured against those system level indicators, business innovation index, as well as ecological factors. And these can be done periodically during the project implementation. So I think this set us on a course where we clearly have clarified how to get there, but it also got us on a path to develop a system level baseline so that we can understand the status of those sort of influences as we got started. And so in terms of addressing those tensions that Evan spoke about, I think it helped to have a strong M&E system agreed upon and woven into the theory of change to really provide our direction. I would say for us that was a good start for WIHAZE. Over.
And Ben, can I just add one thing? I think Dennis gave a perfect overview. And one last thing, as we think about measurement throughout this event today, the market systems baseline, and I'll share a link here to the Beam Exchange page. The market systems baseline, which was a great collaboration with this consortium, helped to set kind of the initial starting phases for the performance indicators, as well as primarily these custom system indicators that Dennis alluded to. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but just want to introduce that as the beginning point of measurement and how the design of the theory of change and activity eventually funnel into that. And there's several people, I think, in the group here who are actually here at that point, in addition to Dennis. Megan Bolden, Meredith Saggers.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to have them here as well.
Oh, yeah. And just for the mention, I think the orange boxes here speak to those system level indicators that we identified and that we are assessing periodically into implementation. Over.
Fantastic. Great. Well, let's move over then to the second tension, which can often face MSD programs, which is there's often an expectation that we're going to see those initial results happen very quickly, impact level results measured against some of the standard Feed the Future indicators. And Kristen, I think we lost the slide deck, just FYI. But I would ask then, turn it over to USAID again and ask, as the program or the activity started to get going, and there was, you're starting to get maybe to the end of the first year, and you're seeing the results that you're seeing. How do you kind of navigate that tension of recognizing that, really system level changes need to happen in order to sustainably achieve the kind of impacts you want to see, and yet you're not necessarily seeing the immediate impacts that you're expecting?
Thank you, Ben. This is definitely a good question, and it is true that after one and a half year from when the project started, the mission, USAID started to be nervous about the deliverable because there was not yet numbers to show. The report was mentioning studies, assessment, stakeholder mapping, strategy elaboration, partner identification, and there was not really tangible number. So, and we know that the traditional indicators in the future, what we call normally as standard indicators, are mostly quantitative, and they do not inform about the process. And in the market system approach, the system is also important. So what to do? Orawi as a team was smart enough to come and meet with USAID, and we agreed on the way to show that although we don't have big numbers, but we have a way to show that we are on the right track to the systemic change journey. So therefore, we come up with a market system change midline studies that was done. We were able to set some milestone to document that transformative process that was taking place in different levels. At the end, the lesson learned is USAID was patient enough, and the implementing partner was using innovative measurement tools to show how they are progressing in implementation and how the transformative change was taking place. Successfully, we started some few initial interventions that were taken like pilot, like a proof of concept, and those reporting about those pilots was showing that we have a solid foundation where we will be upscaling and reach more systemic change. Then after we started from the pilot to the upscale interventions, then we started now to show that the numbers started to come. And this was from the second and the third year that we are confident enough, and we're building a trust that using that systemic approach, market system approach, was towards the end purpose of the project that will be reached. That's how we did it. Over.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's turn it back over. Dennis, I think, why don't we hear first from you again, in terms of some of the specific ways when you face that not unusual situation, of course, with a few other wrinkles like a pandemic happening in the mix as well. What were some of the approaches that you took? And sorry, and as I turn it over to you, just maybe checking if we still have a Kristen on the line, or maybe if I should share my own screen to give us a chance to see the relevant slide here.
Yeah, I don't see her, Ben, so I think probably you should share your screen.
Great, we'll do so then. But please.
Yeah, so while you set up the slides, I just wanted to say, going into the second year, this indeed was a tension, a real tension, faced not just between Orawi and USAID, but also within the Orawi team. we needed to sort of assure ourselves and each other that we were on course to achieve, to the extent, the system level sort of indicators that I spoke about earlier. And so just building on from what JD was just explaining, we were beginning to, well, coming out of a pandemic, we were also coming out of a series of assessments, strategies, and so forth. And that, I think, was getting a little boring for USAID. So that means we needed to demonstrate that we were at least on course. And so we sort of started to, around our several interventions, 6 interventions, to align our businesses as they came together to demonstrate what sort of pilots we had in the pipeline, partnerships around, different interventions. In this case, I will give you an example of the animal source food production intervention. So we pulled together the set of businesses that were coming together to address issues of last mile distribution of animal feed, artificial insemination technologies, some aspects of veterinary extension, and we're able to demonstrate how each of these is sort of showcasing a proof of concept to help the sector to make a move towards the desired growth, and with these are the stimulants. They are the fast movers, if you like, who are going in and really exploring, adventuring with us, and trying to work with solutions that were coming out of strategies we had proposed. Keep in mind, we had a full market systems assessment, a gender and social inclusion assessment, and so forth. And all of these came together into what we call the market systems and behavior change strategy. And with these and with our fast movers, we went on to a course to demonstrate, provide some very early signs of what we can do together. Alongside that, we were working to develop a most favorable environment, working with the government entities to make it a lot easier for these fast movers to sort of carve out their niche and engage in a manner that at least motivates at the second level those we would call second movers, mobilizing some crowding in partners, looking at the level of facilitation, the support coming through, and other results. And so this, I think, for us, demonstrating a systems change pathway that feeds into what I identified earlier as the orange boxes. We were able to showcase how market actors are beginning to adopt these practices, and some level of assurance that we are going towards reaching the target, the desired targets. While there were no quantitative results, there was a demonstration of the process. And I think that was a very strong element, especially, as we went into the second year. I think the other point is the fact that with this, we were also able to develop some really excellent projections that started to provide an indication of if this is happening and at this pace, to an extent, we'll be able to reach these quantitative indicators. And I think for me, as the chief of party and the implementation team I was leading, we were beginning to get ourselves out of a foggy sort of environment to demonstrate that, yeah, these system level sort of indicators are actually such a great way to demonstrate, besides just the quantitative numbers, you can demonstrate a process, and that in itself helps to reduce the level of tension between the different parties. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, well, if there's nothing else to add on, I think I'll pass it right over to the third tension so that we get a lot of time for Q&A. So back over to Jean, and maybe I'd like to hear a little bit more from you. Okay, now you've kind of reached the point where you've got some kind of pathways sketched out for what that systemic change can look like, why you think, whether it's via projections or other tools, that you have some sense of progress and you have some understanding of why the change you're hoping to see seems like it's going to come. Can you now talk about a little bit, what do you do next? How do you as USAID kind of get the confidence that really the systems you're wanting to see change are changing? How do you kind of work alongside an IP in that regard? How did you do so with Aurora Wahazi so that you had some understanding of that?
Thank you, Ben. Actually, I think the first thing to mention here and to keep in mind is the proper communication between USAID and the implementing partner. Aurora, we had the team was good at it because when we were through the implementation, we had very regular exchange, very regular monthly meeting, and that will help to keep USAID staff informed about the progress. And Aurora, we have also organized a series of field visits, and that we organized jointly with the USAID staff. And we had also a way of sharing success stories that we tell what is happening. And our house was also creating some platform for exchange, like some business networking event or the current lesson learned events that will capture some specific topics and see how they have been successful and what are the challenges they have faced. So keeping that channel of communication between the IP and the USAID was really very crucial. Another thing I would like to add is that using the CLA, the collaborating and learning adapting approach. It's like during the implementation, we had to always questioning what we are doing. Is it the right thing to do? Is it the right way to do it? And what are the challenges we are facing and how can we address those challenges? And this was implemented and it have informed always the implementation of the activity. For example, when you see the number of intervention, you will find that some intervention have triggered additional implementation or additional intervention, because when you started implementing, you will find that the new challenges you want to address, or you will find that you need to address additional issues that were raised by the implementation of the first intervention, like addressing some policy issues but through working with the government of Rwanda and addressing those issues. So this kind of learning process, adapting and keeping a proper communication between implementing partner and USAID was really very important for the success of the order we had. Over.
Great, thank you so much, Jean. I'm going to pass it now over to Viv, and perhaps you can share a few examples of that communication around what you were seeing in terms of changes, how that conversation went, and kind of what you spotted.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Before we dive into the details on the slide here, feel free to peruse through, I think, just some framing and big picture thinking about, I think, bringing all these conversation points together is that, I mean, throughout the course of now, I guess, 4.5 years, when we as a consortium looked at systems change and measurement, it wasn't any one particular tool. There's a variety of different tools that looked very different. I think we start off talking about, of course, having the custom system indicators as a important piece of this puzzle to help measure things like trust and cooperation within the system, ecological factors that influence the choices around using or consuming animal source food in your diets, which we're going to spotlight just now, and changes in business innovation index, among others. And throughout the course of the project, we had a 3-phase, really in-depth systems change assessment, right? We have the baseline at the beginning of the project, the midline, which we're about to speak to, that we conducted in year 3, and the end line, which we're actually designing and planning for to be held in the coming months. But within all of these, there were several others. There was a rapid outcome harvest that we're also in the process of completing, We looked at sentinel indicators, leading indicators, measured through learning studies that were a little bit more rapid, quickly, that kind of fed into our CLA system as well, to give us a sense of what are some emerging signs of systems change, what are some emerging signs of adoption, behavior changes, feedback from the system and the market actors involved in the system across the board. There were several different types of market systems, health monitoring tools used as well. And I think a lot of us might even defend the fact that the observations from the team and a lot of different learning sessions that both Jean-Damascene, Dennis, and Evan have spoken to, that's where a lot of the fun and exciting pieces come to, because there you get to corroborate information and insights from all these different tools and bring them together. And then make decisions on programming as well, and adapting our models, the partnerships we facilitate, thinking about second, third, fourth movers, and so on and so forth. So that's just a bit of framing. And I mean, I have to say a lot of these tools, for example, as we had kind of discussed in the chat and Ben had alluded to before, a lot of credit goes to, I mean, Megan Bolden was here with us in the beginning of the project alongside Dennis and Meredith Sagers. I think Carol Pimentel Correa, she's in this group as well. She's our research expert who leads a lot of these studies alongside David Biringuido. So I just want to note that as I speak to some of these pieces, and they'll chime in as needed. So let's dive into the ecological factors index. This may or may not make sense, but to give you some context, this was actually designed newly as a new index, particularly for Ora Wahase, because of that systems focus towards influencing and changing dietary behavior. And we had learned early on, collectively as a consortium, alongside Catholic Relief Services, CRS, and the Manoff Group, thinking about the fact that diet doesn't simply change because of one or two reasons. There are several different factors that influence why people choose to consume what they choose. And so we kind of structured it in a way, thinking about a few different layers. We looked at individual factors, interpersonal factors, and institutional factors. So these are factors that affect your decisions on diet at different levels. And Ben, if you just click once more, I think there's a circle that should pop up. There you go. And so these are all looking at behaviors, conditions, and beliefs that exist and that can be modified, and which, if modified, may potentially result in a change in dietary behavior. And so this was a highly qualitative process, which we then, using several researchers, we kind of brought together to aggregate into an index, both for the different levels of factors and then overall for the entire index as well. So you can see in the table in the bottom left, just really quickly, how things had shifted numerically from baseline to midline. And so there was, of course, a shift, an increase in numbers, but we really want to think about the directionality of the change. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? And the most interesting insights obviously come when we think about the qualitative findings within each of these indices. So we'll spotlight some examples here. The institutional factors, for one. These are really looking at norms that exist beyond the household, beyond the community, beyond the markets. But these are looking at activities that are initiatives that are taking place through other market actors, not necessarily the consumers themselves. We can think about the expectation that ASF, which is animal source food, is available in local restaurants and hotels. The expectations that they're available in local retail stores. That dining of animal source food beyond the household should include ASF. So that might be at social gatherings, at restaurants and bars, so on and so forth. A really interesting one that's actually getting a bit of traction now, which isn't covered as much in the midline, is the expectation that ASF is safe to consume, because hygiene expectations and norms around whether or not buying animal source food from a butcher, a slaughterhouse, or retail store is a concern, and it was one of the core constraints or challenges that we identified early on. So that, I think, is an exciting one, because there's been a lot of traction in changes in that factor more recently. Thinking about the presence of marketing and messaging about the value of animal source food, regardless of where it's coming from. So these are some examples of the different factors that constitute the institutional level. And again, the interpersonal looks at societal, community level changes. An individual looks at within a household and an individual person's beliefs and perceptions and how that's shifting. I want to also add that there was a question about thinking about youth and gender, particularly in these measurements. The ecological factors, among some of our other tools, does look at this, specifically in the individual and interpersonal factors. And the baseline and midline report, it'll kind of lay these out in a lot more detail, but it speaks about the perceptions and beliefs that both youth and women of childbearing age and children under 5 are expected to consume animal source food, because that wasn't always a very deep expectation before the project had started. And I'll spotlight just one example of things that were changing that we did notice.
Viv, just
One particular example was
a time check.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, maybe I'll hold the example because I think it might come up in the Q&A anyways. But this is a quick, I guess, introduction to the ecological factors. And then we can shift to the next slide. And really quickly, this is kind of shifting away from the custom system indicators to thinking about one of the other kind of tools that we try to bring to life in the CLA work and the rapid learning studies. As we kind of think about how the models are being implemented and how successful they're being, or how early signs of systemic change were emerging, using a sociogram really helped us to visualize how things were changing the networks. This particular example looks at how feed manufacturers on the left in the orange circles are interacting with a new market actor called Ox, which is a distributor and a transporter that provides logistics services, is now delivering high quality commercial animal feed to the rural remote parts of the country that we particularly focus on. And these are 8 specific districts. So it shows the different connections and networks that have been established as a result. Almost 2 years later, this has grown quite exponentially, and we're doing a bit more studies to understand this some more. But I just want to highlight that this helps also in our conversations with our teams, in the districts, our partners, and of course, USAID to understand how all of these are changing over time. Thank you.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, I think this could have probably been a 2-hour webinar, but at some point, let's stop talking as a group, and I'd love to turn it over to now hearing from some of the people that have joined us today and some of their key questions. Now, I haven't been able to monitor the chat, but I think there's a question from Jacob I'd like to perhaps pose to the panel as a starting point in terms of the issue of contribution analysis and the kind of reflection. I think we all know that when we're talking about systems, it's extremely rare that any one actor is even primarily responsible for it. But what was the approach taken, perhaps in this case, to kind of reflect on any other contributors, or was that maybe not something that was looked at? I'll kind of open it up, and who'd ever like to tackle that first, please feel free. And of course, we have, as has been mentioned, others within the group beyond our panelists. So I think we've got lots of people. Maybe I'll turn it to Megan as the hand raiser.
I do have one thing to say about the methods of the midline that I think are really useful on the contribution analysis piece. A lot of midlines and baselines are done with a very narrow focus that look just at what your intervention is and or is planned to be. And this intentionally looks at the system. So it used quota sampling within market systems in the specific districts in which Aurora Wahazi would be working, and spoke to a certain number of different actors within those systems. So not all of those actors actually have ever received any support from Aurora Wahazi. So the nice thing about that is then you can go back and you can control for who actually mentioned something specific of an Aurora Wahazi intervention, who didn't. And I'll let Carolina and Viv kind of add to that, Dennis and others. But I do think that it wasn't pure contribution analysis. It wasn't just done as contribution analysis, but by using that method, you're able to kind of see like things are happening in the market, not just with the direct intervention participants, but beyond that, which is the goal anyway. And to what extent are that those people referencing activities that or interventions that Aurora Wahazi was part of or helped facilitate.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Another theme I've kind of seen running through. Oh, pardon, Viv. Did you have an addition there?
No, I think Megan covered most of it. Like a really one-liner is just, I think in a lot of the learning studies that we're doing that are outside of the systems change, the bigger assessments, and also the outcome harvest that we're doing now, there is a bit of a focus to think about and hear from the respondents, their engagement with other programs or activities that may or may not be happening that also influence the animal source food sector. There aren't many in the same nature of what Aurora Wahazi is doing, but of course, there's some complements that help. And a lot of that actually comes from the government of Rwanda, I would say. Some of the work that they're doing, both at the district level, to actually help organize some of these producer groups and different platforms. So those go hand in hand, and we're trying to uncover some of that through some of these smaller studies as well. But overall, I think Megan has covered that question quite well.
Great. A theme I'm kind of picking up on through several of the questions is kind of the, in practice, the CLA aspect of this. Because of course, at this point, we're roughly 6 or so, maybe a little bit more months from the end of the activity. But, as we look through the tensions, there was that messy middle where it's kind of like, oh my, are we on the right track? What's happening? Are we really making progress? And I think that speaks to the CLA element that Jean referenced specifically in one of his points. Perhaps we can, some of the panelists can reflect a little bit more on that kind of nitty-gritty process of figuring out, and elaborating on how did the information that was being shared kind of shape the understanding both at the mission and for the activity of what changes mattered, what is changing, what to do about the kind of, and what the implications are of that information that is emerging. Maybe Dennis, do you feel like you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I will start. I think the CLA component is quite a strong component. As I said, we generated a lot of knowledge in the process from our initial assessments, from our quick learnings as we roll into implementation, very early sort of analysis that informs track towards the achievement. And within the team, we have, regular sort of pause and reflect sessions, our quarterly sort of portfolio reviews. And there's a whole lot of rich information that comes out of there that we have been using in my monthly check-in with USAID, in my regular update, to sort of be able to showcase some early signs. What do we see? What is not working? And how are we going about it? Because this whole engagement with the partners, within ourselves, with USAID, generates some other tensions as well. And we have to be clear to address those. And those sort of make our strong learning component that informs adaptations. There have been activities, for example, that we've cut short, or we have just stopped. We have cut back on the funding, but that doesn't mean we cut the partnership. We kind of scale back and explore what other ways. And we really have been doing this with to an extent, enough disclosure of what's happening to USAID in a manner that they have appreciated that part. So I would like to say the CLA component, I think in my view, we used our internal reflections, and whenever we felt that there was some very good points to advance into a conversation with USAID, we invited the COR over. And I think a strong element within the mission here, they have always come in big numbers when we invited them. And I think that was very powerful, because this whole new MSD way of doing things is not very common. And even within the mission, that I think each time 8 people came out and listened into a conversation, it helped even the COR sort of and ourselves talk through and really understand our situation. And I would like to stop there maybe for now, but colleagues are here and they can chime in to an extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. I might ask Evan, Evan, you posted a response in the Q&A in the chat about this. Anything you'd like to add in terms of from your and the mission's perspective on kind of, as you're seeing this information, you're joining these learning sessions and regular meetings, what kind of stood out or how did that kind of inform your own thinking?
I think Dennis captured it fairly well, but just to add on, I think once they started to actually get the grants moving, I think that's when things went from theory into practice, and then we could also see how things were actually moving or not, and work around that. And then within the mission, I guess the tension was, is Dennis saying, is basically, and JD talked about that, is just managing people's anxiety about they want to see quick results. This is reminding people we're in a sort of a systems focus, which means. And JD talked about that as well in terms of, and sort of Dennis, in terms of the qualitative aspects about change. And then when those things are actually happening, it's not just about the planning part is important, but what actually happens in practice is much more important, because that's actually reflecting what's going on, and that also shows the capability to understand and interpret. So having that system in terms of the CLA processes occur and having those discussions and seeing those things in the field provided the team with that confidence that things are moving along, and that if you're dealing with the team 3 years in and you don't have anything to show for it, it's concerning. But that's not what the case was. I think that the S curve, in terms of how a lot of markets, market systems activities happen, it starts to deliver. And then you also just start to get on that wave and ride it and see what's going and what you can do and where you can work with. And that's where the midline helped out a lot in terms of being able to see, okay, these are where we're having successes and traction, and helping the team to understand, okay, this is where we can measure the system change. Viv's systems map there on Ox and something like that, of the food logistics, the logistics piece was really important on saying something that maybe initially wasn't there, but came into play and helped us understand where are we going to move the system. And I think that Dennis and his team did an excellent job of communicating where were the levers in the system that we should be moving on, that maybe that wasn't the initial focus when we started, but that's what you move to, and you have to be able to grasp onto that and know that that's where you want to focus. So I don't know, JD, is there anything else? Okay, over.
Great. We'll only have about a bit less than 2 minutes. I see Luca raised his hand. So Luca, do you want to contribute something?
No, I was just looking for a reaction. Sorry, I don't know how to use Teams.
Okay. In that case, I'll pick it over or turn it over to a question that Jane asked a couple of questions relating to inclusion, which I think obviously is a really important aspect to reflect on and consider as we're looking at how systems change. Is obviously we need to be aware about how they're changing for whom. And so I'd be curious from the panel, just in reflecting on how that was built in. I think, Viv, you mentioned briefly in some of the measurement tools that there was an incorporation of specific reflection for particular groups, but anything else to mention in terms of how that kind of was incorporated into the activity?
Maybe real quickly, sorry.
Yeah.
Dennis, go ahead. I was going to kick it over to you in terms of talking about focusing on women and differences and things.
Yeah. So thanks. I was just going to say, youth, women, and people with disabilities is quite a focus area that we pick within our objective 2, which largely focuses on increasing demand for animal source foods. We know that there is a category of people who most need these animal source foods. And at the onset, we wanted to be very clear that as we identify partnerships, as we identify innovations, we wanted those that had the most potential to reach these target groups. And not just as beneficiaries, consumers for that matter, but also as market actors. So we've been very intentional. And by the way, this is a consortium, and each of us brings their expertise. Our partner CRS largely drives interventions that speak to increasing demand for animal source foods. And they to an extent bring in a little bit of the traditional approach to ensure that you fully integrate the categories of people. And our job was to always explore to what extent does the market, or is the market position to actually support or to benefit the various categories of people. And so we had the innovations, for example, around savings, community-based savings groups, really, that are already existing, have been formed in many ways to address specific social issues, socio-economic, and we wanted to weave into that the understanding of the role of animal source foods, the importance of animal source foods, and what value they add by being integrated into their action. For example, if they were investing into different productive activities, can they explore say opening an outlet that is going to sell meat, for example, or sell eggs in the community, or in this case, even consider aspects of production. And so we also went into targeting youth groups. There are various youth groups into a bit more of a competitive approach to have some segment or a portion of the grants targeting these groups in a way that they actually compete and demonstrate innovations that are both sustainable but also work to reach those kind of hard to reach groups, youth, women, and people with disabilities. So an approach through the savings, community-based savings groups, through targeted sort of interventions that aimed at the onset to reach these groups. And we actually adapted our
All right.
grants program and
Dennis,
our
I'm
approach
gonna
to serve them.
gonna have to
Thank
grab it away from you.
I'll stop here.
Apologies.
Thank you.
I do want to make sure that we have take the last couple of minutes just to introduce also the practitioner guidance. So I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that MSP and this particular learning stream has been doing has been capturing some observations, particularly from the field in terms of what's been working and approaches, tools, etc., for assessing systemic change. So I want to make sure I give a plug for this recent piece of work that came out. It's it came out from a MEL clinic of different people involved in different activities and where they're leading on MEL. The QR codes will allow you to download it. Of course, you can also get it at AgriLinks as well. But it's a great resource, and I'd encourage you, if you haven't had an opportunity to see it yet, to go forward and take a look. It's structured in terms of 4 key steps. I think they'll resonate in terms of some of what we heard today, and certainly the experience of Aurora Wahaze was one of several influences in terms of the contents within the publication. But essentially, this piece walks through each of these 4 steps and really thinks about what are some ways that you can really do this. It provides practical guidance. It provides a range of different tools and approaches and prompts to think about, question sets, etc. So it's a really nice resource. I'd encourage you to take a look. It uses a consistent case study throughout to kind of explain how to put these into practice or what it looks like to do so. Because I think as we think back to the start, one of the things we heard from practitioners was just that challenge about what does this mean in practice? How do we really make this work? So with that, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time today. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I think there's been a really lively Q&A. If anything else comes to your mind thereafter, please let us know, and we'd be happy to answer it. And
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Fantastic. And just on behalf of the community, thank you so much for sharing with us. This is a wealth of information, wonderful resources, tremendous. As you said, we could easily have gone for 2 hours, so this is great. And I do encourage everyone to follow up with questions either directly or out to the group. We can use the listservs and we can stimulate some conversation there. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again soon at the next one.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good day, evening.